Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm your host, Ann Snyder, and we're spending this season of the podcast attempting to chart the ways and means of social change. How does it happen? What are the ingredients? How do you think about receiving change well, especially if you might feel a little queasy at times about its moral direction? How do we understand the thrust of our own agency amid forces that are always too vast for any one person to drive? Today's episode is a personally meaningful one. Longtime listeners may have picked up by now that I keep kind of a flashlight close by. A flashlight daily seeking to locate the hidden heroes of civic health. And I'm just biased towards the less visible social and spiritual dynamics that are at play when human beings find themselves graced by that full and gathered time that is the mark always of God with us, of God moving in our midst. You often find these moments around tables and leisurely meals, in gatherings of purpose where distractions are seen for the cheap demons they are, and patient attentiveness emerges into the foreground. When ego and glib pontification reach their dead ends, when people truly connect to one another, to our natural creation, to God. These are moments of formation, sometimes profound transformation. And it is on them, I have observed, that the wheels of redemptive history turn. Chelsea and Joshua Bombino have been huge encouragers of the kind of spaces that make way for these moments, both through all that Comment is putting out in the world and through the larger institutional ecosystem we are weaving, known as Breaking Ground. One of their insights together is that a certain kind of wombing is required for true social change to take root and unleash. A kind of incubation of relationship and wrestling that patiently nurture the quiet before. They're calling it spiritual motherhood, and they have written a strikingly unique essay in the current issue of Comment titled just that, quote, Spiritual Motherhood, Wombing Change, Nurturing Life. We're going to get into it here, and I'll put a link to the piece in our show notes, but I want to thank them publicly for their courage. It's not always easy to inject feminine or horticultural metaphors into our institutional landscape, but increasingly, I think it might be necessary. And of course, not just metaphors, but sensibilities and ways of being that must leaven our leaders, our institutional cultures, our sight and spiritual discernment if the injustices and wicked problems we have inherited are ever to be overcome. A quick bio, Joshua and Chelsea are husband and wife, father and mother. They spend their days juggling home, educating their young children while each pursuing separate and sometimes combined vocational ventures. Chelsea is an attorney by background and has focused her career at the intersection of faith and public life. She currently serves as a program officer for the Fetzer Institute, a fellow with the Center for Public Justice, a columnist for Religion Unplugged, and an adjunct at Mount St. Mary's University. Josh has spent the past 15 years working in behavioral health and for various social service agencies. He now provides therapy in a private practice outside Baltimore, where the Bombinos live with their family. Chelsea, Josh, thank you for joining the podcast today. I'm really looking forward to this one.
Oh, yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
It's an honor.
So, spiritual motherhood, an intriguing phrase. What is it?
You want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to be very mindful about not being a mansplainer. That's my.
We appreciate you, Josh.
To be fair, though, I not only do I mansplain to women, I'm an equal opportunist. I'll mansplain to anybody.
Well, I have to also say sometimes women mansplain too, so it sort of is a sin that crosses both sexes.
Yeah. So, I think spiritual motherhood is first of all, I think it's a funny term because I think both, if you sort of take each part of it, like it can sort of lead you down the wrong path, right? So motherhood, we think of as this sort of, sort of a mundane or sort of ordinary task of taking care of children. And this is not about how to take care of children in a spiritual way necessarily, or incorporating faith into parenting. And this is not about how to experience God and his fullness through the act of taking children either. I think, these when we sort of take these terms together, the idea is about using the notion of motherhood, something that we're all intimately familiar with, either having been mothered or our mothers, and using that as an insight, as like an orientation to the world, an orientation towards family, towards community, to the environment, to social change, and that we can approach these ways of being in the world with that sort of the embodiment of sort of what it means to be a mother. I think that's sort of the most reductionist version, but I think Chelsea can probably complicate it further in sort of enriching ways.
One thing about it is that we think it kind of defies definition, and it's actually really brought to life and animated better by story and example. And so the impetus for me was having children and having a lot of trauma that came about because my own womb essentially failed every time I was able to be pregnant, but ended up having complications that resulted in premature births and health issues after giving birth for both the baby and myself every time. And this was really humbling because I thought I would just be someone who had very easy, healthy pregnancies. And also I was very excited about being probably too excited about becoming a mother in kind of an idolized way. And when that vision kind of shattered for a lot of reasons we probably don't have time to talk about, particularly after the birth of our last born, our daughter, Phoebe, who was born very premature. What does it mean if I can't physically nurture her because I'm also in the ICU and I have to surrender my own visceral sense of what I want to be doing right then on an instinctual level. And part of spiritual motherhood for me has been realizing that it's about holding tightly and letting your womb, or letting your kind of metaphysical womb be a space that others can land, whether you're male or female, like providing that encircling love for people. But it's not just the interpersonal physical love that is shared between a mother and a child, or a father and a child, or even between our kind of immediate friends and family. Like, what does this mean, this kind of spiritual mothering, when we bring that into our connection with God first and foremost, and really viewing God's love for us as a space that is wombing, it is holding us, but it's not a stagnant kind of inanimate vessel that's only a container. It's really a nurturing garden that continues to renew and regenerate and co-create with us every day. And when we think about that beautiful, but also sometimes wild and messy and untamed nest of God's love, I think the spiritual motherhood, that wombing love, is a space of co-creation for both the one holding the space and providing the encircling love and the one receiving. And ultimately, I think part of spiritual motherhood is also about release. It's about, yes, being the womb, but also letting others hold you in that encircling love and kindness, and having to rely on Josh. And even relying on my husband is hard for me. And so I think that was really humbling, and seeing Josh be just like a much more naturally empathetic person than I am, and seeing the ways in which he had read 0, probably, or maybe 1 baby book, and he'd like see like a 4-year-old and be like, so are you in middle school? Like, he really wasn't someone who was like super connected to a lot of kids before having them. And just to see him kind of instinctively pick up a baby, maybe learn how to fumble through diaper changing, and now like close to 5 years later, it's just something that's so natural for him. He doesn't bat an eye if he has like, bodily parts on him from other people. And so, yeah, that really kind of that spiritual motherhood isn't some kind of pristine Victorian idea, but it's really the embodiedness, almost the sensuality of showing up for others, including like what that means in society. Like, how can we really show up with that type of visceral love for people we'll never meet? And
yeah.
I was up late last night, actually thinking about this, way too late, but But I had this thought that, we've been having conversations about this for a long time, and, we wrote about it, and then we sort of had more conversations in sort of preparation for this conversation. And then this sort of new thought occurred to me that, spiritual mothering, right, implies a child, right? And I thought, and this, it was just this sort of thought that just sort of inserted itself into my brain, this sort of memory, right? That Jesus said that the kingdom of God belongs to the children. And I was thinking, well, what is it that children have that we don't have as we get older, right? And what is it that we lose? And I think that the experience of a child with its, their whole world is their mother, right? That it's a sort of complete attachment. All that they need in the world necessarily comes from the parent. The experience of love, of sustenance, the introduction into the world, the forging of connections with others and community and relationship. And it's that enveloping love that is, I think is that sort of Jesus is sort of pointing to, is like, when you can experience God in the way that a child experiences the love of its mother, and that, complete attachment to its mother, that is the kingdom of God. And so spiritual motherhood, I think, is trying to facilitate this experience in the world, to see the world, to see other people, to see the institutions that in which we work as the children that need this enveloping love. And that is facilitating, the experience of shalom on earth, right? That is, I think, spiritual motherhood.
I mean, I like what you said. We actually hadn't talked about that, but
it was late last night. I didn't have a chance.
I go to bed at like 9 o'clock. The piece around, like, it reminds me of like that it's a stupid Jimmy Fallon children's book we have called Everything is Mama. And just this idea, like, it's one of the first words. Now in our house, it's everything is dada first, which I think is common. But this idea of that parental love, of that space that isn't just it's not just a philosophical notion. It's not an ephemeral abstraction. Spiritual motherhood is a physical body that can hold you. It is recognizing the earth as a spiritual body that can hold, a physical body that can hold us. That is also God's creation. And it's recognizing, I would argue, the communities in which we decide to live our lives, both those we choose. And I know for some, those that are kind of their only options, that we are called to be planted there, that we're called to, I think Hildegard von Bingen, in one of her beautiful, beautiful compositions, says that the Virgin's womb is essentially a welcoming, hospitable space for a seed that has not yet fully sprouted to cultivate itself. And I think about, spiritual motherhood is really holding enough space, including, a space that is biodiverse, that isn't all just one thing, to really allow that wonder to be cultivated in ourselves and in others. And it's a lot easier, I would argue, in some ways, to be a biological, physical mother, where you have a child who is naturally prone to wonder. But when you are trying to cultivate wonder and loving kindness towards someone that maybe you have a conflict with, or maybe an institution or system that is advancing ideas or values that challenge your own deeply, and yet you see a calling there to steward a relationship with them, then I think that's kind of some of the essence of spiritual motherhood. It's almost covenantal in nature, and you don't have to call it that, but that it is the acknowledgement of this deeply personal and sensual bodily love, but not keeping that in our kind of 21st century overly idolized nuclear family, but asking, like, what does that mean for how I love God, how I love, yes, individuals in my personal life, but also how I steward love into our social systems and institutions in the ways that I've been equipped to do so. And what does it mean to really love where God has placed me? Like, do I know the particular weeds in the cracks, like their names, and the cracks in the sidewalk outside of our house? Do I know how the particular topography of the river valley in which we live has shaped not only the fact that our basement floods regularly, but it's shaped justice issues for African Americans who live here, because they experience more flooding than others. And so really understanding how all of it is interconnected and being able to hold that in a society that really incentivizes us compartmentalizing ourselves, even our own senses, right? I was embarrassingly saying to Josh last night, like, I think, although it's great for multitasking, I think I need to cut down on listening to a book or a podcast for work while, even if I'm reading a children's book I know really well or singing a song I know really well, just that splitting of ourselves really going to create this sense that we are little more than machines that can produce outputs rather than having kind of full-bodied experiences.
Yeah, just to tag on to that idea that we incentivize and prioritize efficiency as a society. Evidence-based practices for we have model legislation that is sort of used all over the country, and so this sort of cookie cutter approach to how we structure and organize ourselves,
almost like a franchise model for life.
Yeah, and there is some value in that. Like there are real patterns that repeat throughout the world, and there is real evidence to suggest that certain interpersonal or social or economic interventions help people and are more effective, but none of that happens in a vacuum. And so you really have to do the grassroots work of understanding, like, how do we sort of take the work that we're doing and apply it to the community that we're in. And I think that's more challenging now because I don't think we've caught up to being a global society.
No, it's happened too fast.
Yeah, with this sort of access and communication and internet technologies, the way we can share information and sort of see and participate in other parts of the world, and the scale of that is so broad, we have to sort of rely on these cookie cutters, right, approaches. But for most of human history, it's life happened for the most part where you lived, and you had intimate connections where you lived, and you knew what worked here, and you weren't thinking about what was happening 2 towns over, or the next state over, the next country over.
I'm so encouraged by this because the tone with which you're talking about this, on the one hand, I think we all, whether it's the prophetic or the radical or the sort of revolutionary, those kinds of imaginations can give us a sense of true north. But I think things like institutions, scale, structures, efficiency can often be pitted totally against this more sort of kind of love-based nurture. It's funny because I'm often trying in my own work to sort of not have them be an either or. And I don't know if that's long-term possible because I think having different friendships and formative influences on kind of both sides of the tracks of the institutional mindset, and we'll just say masculine, feminine here to
and that's you being a spiritual mother. Like spiritual motherhood doesn't reject things that are necessary, that work, that help our society grow. Things like, to some extent, scale and thinking about really amazing theories that take on a logic model or a linear direction, or things that reflect, some of the positive things that have come about due to kind of neo-enlightenment space. But you also are constantly kind of holding the space to dig deeper, to say, like, what is allowing the forest to flourish? What is allowing the city to flourish? It's often these underground networks of friends. I think your common issue on friendship was a major inspiration for the paradigm of spiritual motherhood, because it did tell, like, you shared kind of what your thoughts were, but there was this space for showing. And you did not have kind of a cookie cutter set of articles or poems or artwork that led to one easy conclusion about how this kind of really kind of intentionally cultivated friendship networks that didn't fit neatly into one box of our lives, right? Like they crossed over from vocational to spiritual to familial. I think that is where spiritual motherhood holds a lot of possibility, because it's a rejection of the either or. And it says, just like God gave us 5 senses, we often are thinking in dualities. We're thinking in binaries because we have 2 hands. Maybe that's what some science says. But the reality is we wouldn't say I mean, I know we do at dinner parties sometimes, like, would you rather, not have sight or not have hearing? But the reality is we thrive as a human to do both. So I just wanted to lift up how much you contributed to our
Thank
own
you.
thought work on this as a spiritual mother and as a friend.
Thank you.
Chelsea also exposed our secret mission here. Is by the end of this podcast, we'll have exposed you to the world as being a spiritual mother. We're making our case.
Okay. Oh dear. Well, I have editing powers here, so no, that's just really encouraging because it's tricky. We just live in a time of so much misunderstanding and on kind of all sides, and the desire for these kind of binary battle frames between different logics, and I would also argue different vocabularies. And for better for worse, years ago when I was studying institutions, as well, I certainly Chelsea, looking at this sort of fabric of what makes an institution really formative. And it's so what your phrase, we are all, and both of you talked about, we all have an intimate relationship with motherhood, whether we are one or whether we are born from one. However, full of glory and beauty and grace, or full of trauma and pain. And when I began years ago trying to just chart out a different kind of verbiage to talk about institutions and why I, as a Gen X millennial borderline person, believed in them, I was using, I realized, more of a care vocabulary than a power vocabulary, because institutions in my own life had stepped in when I had lost family and lost this sort of the kind of love circles of life in my own story. And institutions, much to my surprise, I became attentive all of a sudden to the ways in which, not always, hopefully we build into institutions as individuals who learn how to be healthy and professional and all those things. But, in my case, there was a season where a variety of actually professional institutions, religious, kind of support kind of groups for immigrants, they sort of held me. I had to be held. And I decided to say that is a fundamental piece of what it means to be a fully orbed, healthy, common good serving institution, is you have to have the grace of holding people in times of transition or their own wounding or weakness. And so I just really appreciate you having this both and approach in the world in which we live. None of this is easy work. I think especially we're kind of, you guys are, I think, showing this through narrative but putting language to this, I do think is important, just to help, you use the word orientation, Joss, sort of birth and encourage a new awareness, a new color on our lenses as we look at reality. And I was wondering, as you've worked on this essay, and then more broadly in your lives, I think as you're trying to live integrated lives in your respective vocations as parents in Baltimore locally, who have been some of the both exemplars, in this essay you mentioned specific historic women whose sort of labors in retrospect, no pun intended on the word labor, can be seen as a kind of spiritual mothering of movements or social and cognitive shifts in a moment. But who have been some of either those exemplars or sources intellectually who have granted you some resonant vocabulary to work with?
So I would say we've both been really meaningfully impacted by, and honestly, this was this journey, I would say, started with Josh's amazing library that I thought he needed to get rid of when I first met him 8 years ago, because I've completely changed my mind. Now I'm the one that has a book buying problem. But when I first met him, Josh was living in a little cottage on a farm without internet even, and he was just an avid reader. And so was I, but I was raised in this household with very pristine environment. And we would read a book and take it back to the library, or we'd read a book and donate it to a bookstore. There wasn't an accumulation of the books I had read. So I had read hundreds of books and not had many of them. And I thought it was fascinating that he had kept his. And so I proceeded in our first year of our relationship, which it also involved getting engaged and planning a wedding and working full time for both of us. And Josh was in grad school. I did a lot of reading from his library. And so names like Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, who were really not on my radar, and I hate to admit that. Josh could talk better about people like Heidegger, but there was these threads there around the idea of a hero's journey that I found fascinating, that I think is generative, that I think is true in many ways. But then I also was very interested in like, but where are the women? Like all of these hero's journey examples of kind of going out is about kind of this individual, not kind of a group of people you're doing life with or communities of mutual support, this kind of like lone individual that goes out on a journey and has encounters and trials throughout, but it's really about him kind of coming to learn something about himself and then finally go home when he's had both the external journey and the kind of psychological or spiritual journey. And that's a beautiful model, but it's also missing this piece of going within and going deep where you're planted. And you see that in Jeremiah and really, what do we do when we're in exile? Like God calls us to grow gardens. God calls us to have families and invest in our communities. And so really that type of orientation to spiritual motherhood, I think was a bridge for me from Campbell, who's not a Christian writer in any traditional way or even vocation, like proclaimed way himself. But he was influenced, we know, by Christianity, by the church. He knew, he spoke positively of Christ and of these examples of deep, deep love, and gave language for me to talk to non-Christians as well about this, which I think is important, that we're constantly having influence. And then I would say the other more recent examples, even some of this since writing for you, Anne, I was really impacted by the friendships article comment or
issue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And since coming out of that, I've just been really drawn to books that challenge the notion of like a single female or male hero. And so have been doing some deep reading, including not in my area. So recently read a book called Metaphysical Animals about the friendship of 4 female philosophers in England around the same time like the Inklings was going on with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And they're so different. Like some of them we know, like Elizabeth Anscombe is a famous Catholic philosopher who helped introduce virtue ethics or reintroduce. But the women that she was in relationship with were women like Iris Murdoch and Mary Midgley that had such a different philosophy than she did, and probably actively rejected so much of her philosophical underbearings, but they strengthened each other's arguments. They loved each other. They brought out the best in each other. They challenged each other. Iris Murdoch famously said that she did not believe in God unless she saw Elizabeth Anscombe with her husband and children and like that type of relationship speaking to her, and Christians witnessing, yes, deeply within their faith communities, but also holding that space and wombing those in their discipline. And these 4 women were women who did not have any, there were no other really female philosophers working in England at the time. And so their friendship wasn't important just because they were friends and like they bonded over being women philosophers, but it strengthened each of their respective works, and it emerged in a body that tells a story about, yes, them individually, but also about the deep rootedness of their friendships and how that friendship shaped them over many, many years.
We were talking about language, right? The sort of how do we sort of crafted language around this. And it was really, I think, about the way Heidegger uses language. I think I read somewhere that he tortured the Germanic language to be able to get across these ideas that sort of penetrate underneath the surface and sort of using, in the same way.
That's sort of what I mean. Like, it's like, I feel like sometimes I'm torturing institutions to like breathe this deeper reality. So it's a violent verb, and Heidegger, well, none of us are any Heidegger, but keep going, Josh.
I am kind of moved by his sort of broad idea about being in the world, right? And that there is this sort of, constant sort of dialectic that's happening between ourselves and our objects and in our environments, and that we shape our environments and that our environments shape us. To know a person requires to sort of know the artifacts around them and to know the actions around them, and that there's this sort of like circular knowledge as you sort of like go deeper. I think that's an organic process, right? And that's, I think, Western intellectual tradition sometimes is not really organic. It's highly formulaic and structured, and that this process of thinking and creation is is rhizomatic. We'll probably talk about network structures, but the notion of a rhizomatic network structure where all nodes in that root system can connect to each other and to any other node, right? As opposed to an arboreal root structure, which is like that tree, branching, like there's a hierarchy, right? And that one branches into two and then two branches into four. But, all those different parts, at the bottom of that structure don't connect. And I think that this organic sort of rhizomatic root structure of social institutions, the way they sort of connect. One of the ways in which you're a spiritual mother, and is that you, I think, are a perfect example of sort of cultivating these sort of rhizomatic root structures in networks, right? Like I've seen you do that with Breaking Ground, for instance, and how you have this sort of network of people, and you kind of like go out, but instead of saying, well, this is my network, I'm going to make access of this network. You go out and you say, I'm going to bring these people together, because I think that when these people come together, that it's going to spur, it's going to give birth to new ideas more than I just can come up with my own, and that it's going to plant seeds and create newness, and that and they will go off and do that. But it's still furthering this sort of vision that you are trying to bring into the world, knowing that like it's not about you, right? And I think motherhood is very much an ego destroying venture, right? That to be a mother, you have to be in service to this thing that you're giving life to, and that ultimately that thing that you give life to goes off into the world on its own, and you have given everything to it, and now that is the thing of attention, as opposed to me.
There were a couple of other, just in case your listeners are interested, they're going to have to probably do more research on this. I did just write down some kind of more traditional sources that really shaped our thinking about this that we read in the last year. I mean, one is the Catholic philosopher Alice von Hildebrand, very much shaped her book, The Privilege of Being a Woman, in particular. And I don't know if I agree with every single kind of ethical conclusion she draws. I would say that I may hold kind of like gendered behavior a little more loosely, but if you can hold that and see that beauty, I've really been moved by that lately. Jasmine Holmes is another. I don't know if your readers would be familiar with her. She is a Christian author. She has a famous evangelical pastor father, but I don't love identifying people that way. She's a young millennial African-American voice. Her books, she also has a podcast. I think she hosts with the Gospel Coalition. But her book, Mother to Son, really moved me probably 3 years ago now, and very much based on kind of Langston Hughes' book to his nephew. And she wrote it while she was either pregnant or just having delivered her firstborn son. And then her most recent book has been just game changing for me. And I honestly discovered it after writing this article for you. But for me, it's probably the paradigmatic example of spiritual motherhood. It's published through a Christian imprint. It's explicitly faith-based, or it's explicitly Christian, traditional, or little o Orthodox. And it's about 10 Black women whose names I knew one of them. And she admits that she loves Black women's history, and she knew none of these voices when she started the book, and that's why she wrote it. And she puts their stories into conversation with each other, and they all have some connection to at least one other woman in the story. They all lived during mostly the 1800s. And she goes deep into how they built social institutions, founded churches, went on missionary trips. In the 1800s, Black American free women were going to other countries to spread the word of God, who built schools, who completely were responsible for the thriving of certain African-American communities in Reconstruction, and how their faith was central to all of it. So that has been just really shaping for me in the last few months, and made me go on little rabbit trails about these women. And faith was at the center for them. And for them, it was actually the friendships. It was the connective tissue. It wasn't one woman being the hero. It was every woman in herself being multivalent, fully bodied, being maybe an artist, but also a political activist. And those things were deeply related and not kind of segmented. So I'd really recommend Jasmine Holmes. This book is called Carved in Ebony. And also the way she approaches how she did her research, I think is fascinating and speaks to how if we only look at written, academically approved Oxford or Rutledge type sources, which I love. I've contributed to those sources myself. We can really limit how we understand history, including particularly oral history, material culture, like a fully sensory experience. And she brings a lot of that in. And then Joy Harrow is a Native American poet who your listeners probably do know. I would say she's influenced a lot of this thought work just from that kind of matrifocal focus in many Native American communities. And then Suzanne Simard is the other one. She wrote a book in the last several years called Finding the Mother Tree. She's a scientist in British Columbia who studies old growth forests. And essentially, mother trees are hub trees in these larger networks of thriving forests. They're often the oldest, but it's not them just themselves. It's their deep root systems and the mycelium in their root systems that allow the trees to help nourish each other. And so her research she's a scientist, but she wrote this beautiful kind of braiding sweetgrass style book that weaves together the science that's very clearly accurate in my mind. I could be wrong. I'm not a scientist. With the deep relationality that we see God building into not just the need for humans to thrive, but the way that God created ecosystems to also depend upon each other to thrive.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if I think we both also have sort of personal experiences too that were, sort of non-academic. I think that sort of helped us experience this idea. This might surprise the listeners, but I have a mother. I actually think that that my mom has sort of embodied, I think, a lot of these qualities, and I sort of shaped. Well, clearly, I mean, my mother shaped my thinking on what motherhood and just parenting in general is. But she was a person who took root in the communities that she found herself and just sort of threw herself into being part of them. And she was very creative. I mean, and she everything from organizing a petition to get a stop sign put in because there was this a dangerous street where the community kids were walking to, when we lived in Chapel Hill, my stepfather was going to grad school. We were there for a few years, but somehow she took it upon herself to, with another person, to create a local travel guide. I think because she was looking for things for the kids to do. I have an old copy of it, and I'm sure everything is outdated because that was 40 years ago. But that was just she just was deeply interested in where she lived and was deeply sensitive. I mean, I remember. I think now they have a term for it, highly sensitive people. That's where we are in the 21st century. We have clinical terms for highly sensitive people. But she, I remember she was just deeply moved if she saw a wounded animal, even if it was on a nature biography, right? But she extended that sort of compassion and care and thoughtfulness to the world around her. I think another thing too, and Chelsea alluded to this. I lived on a farm. It was actually sort of the hub for a Native American spiritual community.
Lakota, right?
It was a Lakota tradition, yes.
Yeah.
And the farm was owned by this couple, and the man, Uncle Henry Neese, has since passed away, but his wife was also, I think she was often sort of in the background because Henry had such a strong personality, and he was this kind of hero, Joseph Campbell hero type character. He was an artist. He was gregarious.
He was a little patriarchal at times.
Well, he was a product of his generation for sure. But his wife, I hadn't planned on it. When I lived there and I helped sort of take care of the property some, I had no plan that I would sort of develop this sort of really deep, meaningful relationship with his wife, who really, I think, kind of mothered me. And there would be many mornings where I'd be having coffee with her at their dining room table or their kitchen table. And she took the time to know me in a way that beckoned me into knowing myself.
Wow.
Right. And she sort of knew who I was becoming before I knew, right, before I did. And she sort of saw these things in me, and she didn't really shape me. She just was able to pull this out in me, to give a place, a place for it to sort of breathe and grow, and to put a little bit of sunlight on this thing that was sort of gestating in the darkness. I think about this as like Harriet Tubman, friends, right? Like seeing freedom's destination, like for the people that she was shepherding to the north, that she, like in the dark of the swamps and in the night, that she knew, and she always had an eye on what that final destination was, and freedom's destination. And I think this is how mothers know their children. I think mothers know things about their children's long before they do. I often hear stories about sort of children discovering things about themselves, and the mom's like, "Oh yeah, I knew. We didn't say it, but we knew that this is who you were going to be, or who you were becoming."
And part of that is holding that loosely. Like you may know instinctively, but also you give the other person the freedom to be who they need to be in the world. And maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. Like, I would just say that um there could be damage with saying like mothers always know. And I think there's true. I think there is like this strong intuition that comes with that deep, and I don't think it's limited to women at all, right? Like this deep sense, this deep God-given sense of knowing that comes from deep love and relationality, whether that's with deep love you feel for the flowers in your garden or for the law you help craft that maybe seems really technocratic, but its fruits will help people live better lives. Or maybe it's deep love for another human that's sitting beside you. And those are differently expressed. But like, yeah, that deep love. I would just say about the two examples Josh used, I would just say they are women who've had like tremendous influence on my own life, and to the point where it's like deeply personal to share. But something that needs to be said about these women is their influence doesn't stop at the personal. So Paula, for example, Josh's aunt, she helped found this spiritual community that has been the only Native American spiritual community, as far as we know, that is sustaining and active in the local DC Baltimore region, that meets regularly, that hasn't lost its commitment to its spiritual beliefs, that still in very many ways honors beliefs that have fallen out of style. Like there's not videotaping out there at all, or photography. When you are there, you are reverent and you wear clothing that makes like a Sunday morning at Capitol Hill Baptist look scandalous. Like you wear very long long skirts and like covered shoulders, and you may or may not agree with that, but you respect it. And she's really an institution builder, and she, in so many ways, I think if you pulled all 300 people that were there this summer for what was her final Sunday on, she kept it going 6 years after Henry passed away. I think everyone had just been touched on a very personal spiritual level and a very maternal level by Paula, and the way that Henry was kind of didactic. You would kind of learn how things worked through him, but Paula really was the heart and
She
soul.
embodied. I think embodied it. Yeah.
And like there's things in history, like there's things in the New York Times and the Washington Post about people that have been involved in this community. There's a diversity. There's social workers who work in Baltimore. There's art teachers, but there's also people who are involved with like very famous musicians and go on tour with them. And so I'd just say like this community has had so much influence, and really in many ways has impacted the people that involved in it in a way that was kind of like that incubator, the underground network of relationships. And with your mom, I was going to just say the same thing. She is someone who, like, her name is not known nationally, but she has like this multi-talented repository of like, she's sewn costumes for Muhammad Ali, and she helped lead the macrobiotic movement, and these little ways where it wasn't that she was fighting to have her name on the book all the time. And there are ways that she clearly contributed to major cultural, social, and spiritual movements that shaped our country in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And she has the letters to kind of show, and like, not that she should have to prove it, but you just think about often it's like women are not at the forefront of history. Well, we don't study women artists because there is no great women artists. We know that's not true. We do know that there's certain art and cultural products and ways of being and living in the world that are more valued than others. And so I think just lifting up these women who are, or it's not always women, right? Like I feel in many ways it's Josh being a spiritual mother to me. And for the last several years, he's let my career kind of take the driver's seat. But I think there is really something there. And just with your mom.
I have to say something about that quilt that she made. So my mom, we attended, we're members of an Episcopal church in Pennsylvania, and there was a major sort of diocesan event that was occurring. It was an art and cultural event that was sort of planned for a year with representation from all the churches to sort of come together, and they for this project somehow my mom sort of created this quilt, this giant sort of tapestry. I think it was probably 20 feet by 20 feet, and it was a rose window quilted together from ties, like neckties, of parishioners in the diocese. And I remember when it was happening, we would, garbage bags full of neckties would show up, or sometimes in our house, or we would have some come in through like a package in the mail, and there would be like a handful of ties and like a note, that's written about what these ties were. Like, this was the tie my husband wore on his first day to his job, that he worked at for 20 years. And so it became this sort of like weaving together of stories and community, and sort of came out in this rose window. And I think that we're talking a lot of metaphors, and I think we want to probably talk about some of the women sort of see the boots on the ground, I guess, as it were, but of what this actually looks like. But that orientation to like reaching out, into the soil and kind of like bringing it towards you, sifting through it, finding the life and allowing, shining some light on it and letting it grow, knowing that there's seeds of possibility here and that you have a vision for what it might be, but also sort of holding that intention with allowing it to be what it will become. And that there is a way that you can be really fruitful in creating, meaningful institutions in that way.
What are the implications for this lifting up this orientation, putting some language around it, trying to encourage it? Like, Chelsea, you're in philanthropy now. Like, how does this relate to the sort of change the world crowd?
Yeah. So, and that's the crowd I'm in, right? And you too, Anne. So, and Josh too, in different ways, right? So, I think it's really important that we talk about that, because I think that what happens, frankly, is that often conversations like this, where beauty and sensuality and interpersonal relationships are brought in, it's often dismissed as like, oh, that's nice, but that type of thing.
Mushy is the word I hear.
Sentimental, right? Mm-hmm. So I actually want to give like at least one concrete example that was not in the article because I hadn't discovered it then. So I think the article is in many ways like us articulating these ideas in kind of one cohesive frame that is also itself not stagnant. It's like, it's living, it's embodied, it's dynamic.
Nor complete.
Right. Yeah. It's not complete. It's constantly evolving. And so, Anne had for many, I think for several years now, really encouraged my thought life you have and the communities you've cultivated to think about these types of prescient moments that come up. And I think coming out of a pandemic, it feels like that. It felt like that for the last 3 years, at least for us. And there are moments where you see historically groups of people coming together. They're often hidden, they're often underground, they're often deliberately not in the public square right away. You see this in particularly, in recent books that have covered this phenomenon, like The Quiet Before. And you see it across disciplines too. I would just say you see this in legislative conversations. You'll see like they go and I was just at the Constitution Center in Philadelphia over the weekend. It was very clear the founding fathers, for all their flaws, it was like when they were negotiating the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, that was not a public conversation. There wasn't media constantly harassing every step they took. They went in and they had the internal debates and their internal relationship building too, so that there'd be trust enough. So really, even with all of its really endemic brokenness in many ways at the founding of our country, you do see these ideals at least laid out there. And the thing that has come up for me just very recently, and actually, like, I don't think we're supposed to say this, like, as women, we're supposed to be like, we went to JSTOR and we got our sources, and I did that. But it started off with a picture book that Josh had from his childhood. It was a woman who had written a picture book about his hometown of Bethlehem, which was founded by Moravians, who were a group of kind of German Anabaptists in the 1700s who came to America because of religious persecution, like a lot of other kind of German groups coming to Pennsylvania at that time. And this woman, Catherine Milhouse, had written this short book about the founding of Bethlehem on Christmas Eve. And Bethlehem in Pennsylvania is kind of now known as Christmas City. So long story short, read this book. Then I was really interested. Her artwork was fascinating. And a quick search revealed that she had been hired during the FDR administration as a federal supervisor with the Federal Art Project, which was part of the larger Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression. And I got really interested. You see these iconic images of hers that you'd recognize that kind of demonstrated Pennsylvania. And this was a period where there was no money. If you were an artist, you were certainly a starving artist during the Depression. And what happened, and I don't know all the policy details. I'm not saying this is the best policy ever or anything like that. But the Works Progress Administration was passed. And what this allowed to happen is it allowed artists, dancers, theater people, composers, people documenting the narratives of the formerly enslaved who were quickly passing away in the 30s. These people were all hired and given a paycheck every week to go and essentially landscape the social, cultural landscape of the United States during the 1930s Depression. So you have women of all people. 40% of all the art supervisors were women. I found this really interesting book that is about women art in the New Deal. And you see that all of these women have networks with each other. Some of them are even both artists, and they're artist and subject. They're doing the folk art. They're doing the art of the people. They're going in, they're telling their own stories through telling the stories of others. They're not at a place where traditionally high art was patronized by people who were the highest level of society, and the folk art of Pennsylvania, or the quilts of the Dust Bowl, or the experiences of the formerly enslaved. Those were things that were not being documented. And these women and the friendship networks they had between them went in, and because of them, it's almost 100 years later, and we have this rich trove that is available to us even in the midst of depression and famine, frankly, there was fruitfulness, there was love, there was cultural renewal that were laying the seeds for, really the kind of economically thriving decades that came out of World War II. And so, it's just fascinating to me, even like the little details. The author of this book I'm reading discusses that when women were taking photos or doing paintings of other women, they were often much more likely to display women together on the town, women together in a professional setting, women together working, on a quilt, as opposed to just kind of the stereotypical, which is often how men would represent women, like beautiful young woman by herself, or, women in the very traditional married with her husband and children type of portrait. And so really this kind of Bechdel test showing up in the 30s of like women photographing women engaging in co-creation together. I believe the first African-American female composer was able to produce her first symphony through this WPA project. So I think that just sheds a lot of light on what spiritual motherhood can do at a kind of scalable social change level. When you are, you have to be really careful though, because part of the challenge of making the unseen seen is that if you dig up all the roots, they're not going to thrive, because it's the fact that they're covered in this rich, fertile, dark, but not dead soil that allows them to flourish. So I think spiritual motherhood just lives in that tension, and that if we can be students of everything around us, right, whether it's how two different species of trees are interacting with each other on a nature walk with our kids, or whether it is dinner party conversation and you hear someone tell an incredible story. I think a mutual friend of ours, and just was telling me the other day about groups of religious sisters who kind of cropped up in after World War II. And it was a complete renewal of kind of multi-perspectival spaces to hold space for really difficult work that had to be done. And yes, clearly I should have mentioned it. We've taken deep dives into Hildegard von Bingen and Julian of Norwich and these medieval female mystics who completely were little o Orthodox Christians and also just profoundly refused to stay in their quote unquote lane, even when they were essentially like living underground in like an anchoress position in a church. I mean, Hildegard von Bingen, you see her being the first female composer in the medieval era that we know. She's one of the only that we have a name for. She's an artist. She's a naturalist type doctor. And you see the multifocal levels that she has. And not every spiritual mother needs to be a polymath, but there's something to deep level of place and deep commitment to knowing the place and not just pretending like place doesn't matter. Deep commitment to individual interpersonal love, a catalytic love for the larger society because of that deep rootedness in place and time.
And I think there's a built-in sort of eco-consciousness too about sort of because it's so rooted in place that when you're engaged in this work that you can't use up all the resources, right? You want to preserve this place. You want to keep this place sacred. This
Replenishing.
Is replenishing so that it's there to be used and celebrated, and not just it's not just a commodity to help get you to your end product, but it is sacred in its own right, and people are sacred in their own right.
Yes, Josh, I want to hone in, if we could, on the specific gender piece here, partly because I think a lot of listeners could validly argue, there is so much focus nowadays on women. Women are doing so well. They might just like just the flat sort of gender narrative right now. And you could argue gender reality in our part of the world. There's actually much more of a quote masculine crisis going on, a crisis of men and boys, all of that. And I'm not denying that. I think that's a whole separate podcast conversation that I share concerns about. Part of why I was so bullish on commissioning this essay with the two of you as a couple is because I really believe that spiritual motherhood does not need to be confined only to women. When I think of some of the most mature men that I've known, there is this wisdom that almost feels like it has transcended the genders to some degree. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about this, and you in particular, Josh.
Well, I'd actually like to start maybe with a biblical reference, and this is in the article, but there's when Joseph encounters his brother Benjamin for the first time, I think the line is that he was moved in his bowels, right? I think but the actual translation is I'm going to give this pronunciation correct, Rachem. And that translation of that is actually so Rachem is the word that's sort of used to first describe God's compassion, and there's its actual meaning sort of references sort of like womb, the womb, right? And so when Joseph is moved by seeing his brother, right? This is a fraternal encounter of love, and he's moved in his womb, is what the Bible says, is the actual translation. And I actually think that there's images of masculinity within the Bible that allow for room for men to have this sort of maternal quality, right? What we think of as feminine qualities, and maybe part of the work that needs to be done is to really unpack to decouple that just because there's sort of a biological imperative that females give birth to babies, that the females have wombs and go through the sort of biological gestation process, that men can be maternal as well, right? That there can be this sort of this loving kindness. And I think there's contemporary issues that might be more controversial than we should get into today around this. But I have seen, through, for instance, my participation in this, Native American community, I have seen the toughest, Marines that, were in combat, that have suffered traumas. A specific gentleman, he was in combat himself, and both his sons were in combat. He was wounded, he come back with PTSD, and moved compassion, moved to tears. This ability to emote and feel, to compassion, to feel with, and so that capacity is within all men, and it's we learn that that's something that we have to be separate from and just sort of keep at bay. And I heard something interesting, actually, Anne, as you were talking about of boys and men. I think there's actually this book that was sort of came out in November.
Richard Reeves.
Yeah, Richard Reeves, right?
Yeah, a very good book, by the way.
Yeah, and I was listening to an interview with him on Sunday, and he was talking about this sort of that there has been this movement where with sort of gender equality that's starting in the 60s and 70s, that today there's been a lot of progress in sort of helping women move into these sort of traditional male dominated fields, but there's not been a lot of movement of sort of men in the other direction, and so he was talking about women towards STEM, and he has this he calls it HEAL, right? So that healthcare, education, administration, and literacy, that there's not been a lot of movement in that direction. And I'm not sure what I'm trying to say for a second.
Are you trying to not sound like men are not privileged?
No, I don't want to get into this conversation of privilege, because I don't think that's helpful. But I do think that there's opportunity and there's room, but there needs to be a safe way of doing that. And there's been attempts for men to sort of stake out a place for themselves in this sort of changing societal structure and norms. There was a mythopoetic men's movement, and maybe some of that was problematic, but it's something that needs attention, and it needs,
like Iron John. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
And I would argue, Josh, that it is precisely spiritually mothered spaces where that safety to uncover the best of what it means to be a man can occur. And that you also need spiritual fathers. So that's a whole separate conversation. But I have just noticed that in our time, when done the right way, with great honor to the masculine and not threat or cancellation or so on and so on, that something mature can be born.
So yeah, and I actually think that those spiritually mothered places create seedbeds for some of this transformation that allow men to experience that. So I myself, I was talking about this gentleman, this Marine, who, he told me, he said, Josh, I never cried, my entire life. And, through his participation in this community, he both got healing and, from, the traumas that he had experienced in combat, but it allowed him to sort of open up. He said, I cried for the first time here because of Henry Niece and Aunt Paula. And I would say that was a spiritually mothered place. Henry himself, he was, what do we say? He was tough as nails, and he was a short piece of leather, but well put together, right? This is a guy who, he was in a cavalry unit in World War II, and, he was short and probably had that sort of like the stereotype of like short men sort of like compensated by being like extra tough. Like he was a tough guy. And he related to, like, he would go in and he would do work with the VA, and he would go down to Walter Reed, and he would work with veterans there and bring them to his property, and he would do ceremony with Native Americans who were sort of returning for combat and needed that spiritual outlet, and he provided that to him. But he could relate because he had that toughness. He fired guns. He loved shooting guns. He could repair anything, but he was also an artist. He was an artist of some renown. He had won a Pulitzer back when I guess they used to do Pulitzers for best new artist back in 1954, and he has work hanging in the Whitney and in the Smithsonian, and he was. And he could be like silly and playful, like a little child, and he could be really gentle, and he could cry with you, and he could see things about you, and he could sort of make a choice when to be the tough guy and when to be the artist and when to be silly and when to be compassionate and gentle and really tender.
When to send you to Paula too, like when he was like, Paula needs to hold this space for you.
Yeah, and when to sort of have Paula take the foreground, and he was certainly not a man without his faults, but I think of him as like a wonderful model for masculinity, of where you can create space for like mothering and tenderness. And even if you're not doing it yourself sometimes, but promoting women around you to do that work. And within that community, there was a lot of men that I encountered, blue collar men, like people who we think of sort of like traditionally masculine, blue collar men that didn't have a college education, that were crane operators and pipe fitters and carpenters and soldiers, but also artists and social workers. And there was a space for doctors, a space for these people to sort of like come together and to cry, to express their pains, to build a community together, to cook food and break bread together, to pray together, to work together. And there's a sign that hung up on the farm that said, "Work is worship." And I think that the act of spiritual motherhood is part of it is when you bring a spiritual context to your labor, right? And that it informs all aspects of the work that you're doing.
When you first raised this frame, this paradigm of spiritual motherhood, I immediately was everything in me just said yes. And if there's a way to articulate this in some initial language, we would love to play host to that, we being comment. My reaction was purely instinctual. And I think there's a huge part of me that has assumed spiritual motherhood just is sort of a gift. It's a gift you can absorb and catch, not be, caught, not taught through exemplars. It's maybe granted spiritually in the context of someone's calling. And you just sort of operate out of it. But the older I'm getting, and when I think specifically about a feminine way of operating in institutions and public, the moments of being misunderstood are painful moments because I'm not trying to alienate and I like to be a bridge builder. And I'm just realizing that there's something about this that is not just instinct. It requires preparation and intentionality and work and discipline, just like any biological mother or any mother of a child would say. I was wondering if you could describe the work that you have thus far discovered spiritual motherhood requires. What kind of preparation and discipline?
I love this question because it allows me to just say that Josh is a much more natural, I would say, in terms of what we think of as the kind of inherent giftings of spiritual motherhood are. And so when we're thinking about a framework that we hold very loosely, that we think is emergent and kind of conversational at this point, maybe that's just the nature of it. Things that have come up for us are, and we've said some of these, but kind of the framework, deep love of God, deep love of connection to God, but not just viewing God as like your interpersonal outlet for prayer and venting or forgiveness and reconciliation, that is all true, that's essential, like Christ's redemptive love for us, but that we see that redemptive love in all of God's creation all the time, which can be like kind of sensory overload for people like me who have a hard time processing all that. I think it comes much more naturally for Josh to see the beauty and love of God. So really love of God being kind of your anchor for all things. And I see this even when we first met and Josh was living on a little tiny carriage house that didn't have like consistently running water or heat. And he was just like, he would be enthralled with the woodpecker pecked in the ash outside of his house or something. So that ability to see beauty in places where it's also dirty, right? To see beauty in the dirt, essentially, and to see that beauty and then name that as God's. That beauty belongs to God and was created by God for us, and our job is to magnify that. So I think really close connection to God, and then kind of the extension of that is seeing God's love so abundantly poured out in our natural world, and recognizing our natural surroundings matter. If we're in the city, it matters that we're in the city. Like, are we cultivating a love for a city, even if we're someone like me who likes the country more? Are we looking at the natural world that still exists in the city? Are we taking into account if this is a river valley or a mountaintop, if it's arid or an agrarian society, like being aware of how God's creation is all around us. And we have kinship relationships and stewardship relationships with that more than human kin, I think is really important. I also just think there's like an abundance of fruitfulness that can come from perspective taking of another creature. And for some reason, like it's completely acceptable for a 3-year-old to think what it might be like to be a cow, for example. So all day long, my 3-year-old, just like our 3-year-old goes around the house mooing or being like, I'm a cow, I'm a pig, I'm a chickpea. Like he has no problem taking on that perspective of an inanimate or inanimate being. And it's like, that is what empathy is at its heart. So I would say love of God, cultivating in love of the natural world and capacity to empathize with the natural world and to even co-create with it, not just viewing it as something we have dominion over in the sense that we can take. And also like recognizing the natural world matters where you are, knowing that being in relationship with the natural world where you are matters. And then thirdly, being in relationship with others in that space, right? So again, the planting the human and plant gardens in Babylon, right? Like the idea that we are deeply investing in relationships in even like Joseph and Daniel and Ruth type relationships with people that we're intimately close to, who we also may deeply disagree with, who we may even consider our adversaries in ways. And we are like, no, we are here to seek their good too. That is the good of the city. It's the good of God's children. And then the last one can be harder. So we have now like love of God, love of nature, love of people God has put in our personal lives. But the last one, love and social institutions, as you've mentioned, Anne, it can be challenging to see the life-givingness within institutions, but also those institutions are ultimately what usually holds together the capacity to love in these other ways. Like love of God is often expressed through our church community. Love of each other is often expressed through love in neighborhoods and families and community organizations. Love of the natural world is often expressed through getting together in gardening clubs and botany societies and things like this. But really seeing social institutions as vital and important, both for our local community and for our larger national and global community, and asking the more difficult questions, like how are we called to bring that level of somatic, empathetic love to our work as citizens in America? The person that comes to mind for me that has helped frame a lot of my thinking and Josh's is Charlotte Mason. So Charlotte Mason is very much known in kind of this day and age in 2023 as kind of like a rediscovered homeschooling guru. Like that's how I discovered her. But really, she was a woman who lived, I think this is actually the 100th year of her death. So she lived her life very much in the late 1800s and early 1900s. She developed a model and approach to education that was centering the whole child, that was centering the child's love of God and like really having to need to understand who is God? Who are you in relation to God? Who are you in relation to the natural world? And who are you in relation to others? And this type of vision where spirituality is incorporated into everything and it's not segmented, where living books and the living environment around children are viewed as so important and life-giving, and things like music and all art and the components that make us human and shape our culture, and help us worship God better, frankly. Those things are not essentially add-ons. They're the heartbeat of how we approach education. But the big takeaway for me was this is not just for children. Like, yes, children are innately drawn to this, but so are adults. So is every human. Like, we were created with eyes and ears, and we were created with at least five senses. And that to really be fully present, we should be experiencing the love of God through the smell of the grass and through the excitement we feel when we read a really dorky legislative proposal like me. It can be this constant intermingling of, the technocratic or the linear or the written word with the experience of going on a walk in our neighborhood, or the experience of taking a homemade baked good to a friend. And so I think that's the piece that for me, really, spiritual motherhood is a way of life that doesn't ask you to give up major elements of who God created you to be, and to say it's the interplay of those that ultimately creates the types of cultural change. When we think about social movements don't exist or function or aren't sustained unless there are cultural artifacts that are created that resonate so deeply on the most deep level. And we see, populists and fascists do this really well, but we see artwork, language. What are you hearing? What are you smelling? What does love of God smell like for you? What does it taste like? What does love of your neighbor smell like and taste like? What about political community? I mean, these are things that are much easier in the local setting, but I think spiritual motherhood has major systemic implications as well.
How does or has Christianity specifically kind of relate to spiritual motherhood? When you consider the very complex, layered history of the church over 2,000 plus years, and I'll use the feminine here institutionally, in what ways is she the beau ideal of spiritual motherhood, and in what ways or eras has the church been the precise blocker of this?
Well, I'm not a church historian, but I think that we should go back and take a look at the Council of Nicaea first. No,
I love that, Josh. We're going to have Council of Nicaea, then Heidegger, then.
So I think that first of all, would just recognize that the church is giant and amorphous and hard to really pin down. But I think the early church, from what little I know of it, seems to me like it was, the sort of organic nodal structures, right? Where they were, early Christians were trying to sort of develop communities and for themselves. And it was not an institution of power. It was marginalized, and it was underground, right? Like I think as Chelsea was saying, right? It was in the soil. And I guess let me talk about the Council of Nicaea. So I think that something happens, right, when the church becomes an institution of power, when the Christian church becomes an institution of power, when it sort of codifies itself, right, and says, this is now what the church is, right? Because I think the early church, there's probably a lot of diversity, right? We know of how that those bodies were sort of forming and how they would sort of live out that Christianity.
We also see in the early church, and again, we are not church historians, so you have those people who listen to your podcast who may be like, that is wrong. So I'm sure this will need a fact check. But we've really been touched by people like the people at the Bruderhof, who is a group that really we didn't know well, Anne, until you were generous enough to invite us to a gathering where they were there. And they live in intentional Christian community. They certainly don't claim it's the only way to live in Christian community that is committed to sharing all things in common. And it's just such a beautiful ideal that we frankly don't like Josh and I aren't willing to commit to that life fully, but that we want to invest in it, right? You see this model at the early church. And then you see, I think that a thing that has drawn me more into church history and the year and a half since my daughter was born was I had an experience at her birth where I felt like the mother of God I felt like Mary came to me. And that's not something I really talk about because I don't have language for it, because I come from a deeply low church, non-denominational background where anything that sounds like that sounds like Mary and veneration. And I have started essentially a journey where I seek answers, and where I'm finding them now is in really interesting, solidly Christian places, but a lot of it's the Catholic Church. And so I am on a journey, and I also have some major differences. I don't know where I will land, but what I love about people like Josh, who is probably not going to become Catholic, is that he's just 100% supported me. And I literally mean journey. I teach at Mount St. Mary's, and the story of Elizabeth Seton, which we do tell, I don't need to tell now. I mean, she is incredibly powerful. Her, the theological output from her, even in her letters and in her journals. It wasn't like she sat down and wrote a tome. It's just so powerful to understand how understanding the church as the mother church, understanding the church as both the bride of Christ and our mother. And we see these parallels all the time. And we see them in places like the Song of Songs, where there is upteen images and metaphors that are used to describe love, that it's essentially a garden, a biodiverse garden of metaphors. It's not a single one. But we see the same one in Christ and God helping us understand our relationship as a body, not just as individuals to him, but as a worshiping body of humans in different ways. And we see that in Mother Church, in Bride of Christ. And those things are not mutually exclusive. We can exist even as a body, as a worshiping body, as the church, we can exist in that type of relationship with God and each other that is constantly multivalent and coexisting at the same time. So we can be the daughter of God, and we can be the bride of Christ through the church. And so I think Mother Church is really this image that at its best, it incubates our capacity as co-religionists, as co-believers in a redemptive savior who is bodily male. Like at least Josh and I are not arguing that Christ is biologically male. And yet you still see Julian of that Julian of Norwich is calling Christ mother, right? And she's not questioning the biology of Christ. She is calling this image of Christ as maternal, which is what he uses himself to gather the chicks to himself. And so that is, I think, the church at its best, is providing essentially internal, incubating, loving space for us, even for us to disagree. And we see this from Acts, basically. Yeah. We see that Christians are not always in agreement on how to love each other and love God.
Yeah, So I think that there's room conceptually within the church, as Chelsea is saying. I think sort of institutionally, I think that there's a hierarchical and bureaucratic structure of church organizations, right? The sort of top-down approach about how to do things. But I think and that's why I was talking about the early church is more rhizomatic. But I think that even that sometimes there's people who carve out, and I think Elizabeth Seton is a good example of that, where she took this. She participated in the structure of the Catholic Church, but she really carved out something that was, extraordinarily unique. And how women who were mothers were able to participate and still have time to be mothers, that they could be, members of the church.
She started a religious community for women who didn't have to make lifelong vows, and women who had dependents could bring them, when normally to enter a religious community, you have to have no dependents and no debt.
Yeah.
Right.
And so she's doing something different. She's responding to the time and the place and the need in that community. Right. And she's being flexible to sort of to create something, to say, just because there's this, we don't have to be in lockstep with this sort of institutional structure. Right. And I actually think that there's other things. So I just encountered something, for the first time, I'm learning stuff. I met a guy who's a member of a lay-led Catholic community in this local area. And they said, like, well, we are Catholics, but we have problems with this institution, and we need something that really speaks to us, that allows us to participate in a way that that we can relate to, because otherwise they might like leave the institution altogether. And they have this sort of, it's a communal group. Like they lead it together.
They set it up within the structures of the Catholic Church, right?
Yes,
like
they're still members of the Catholic.
The Catholic Church allows these types of lay-led communities in mission-based spaces, and even though they're in the greater Baltimore area, they recognize missions are not just places where people have never heard the gospel. It can be where people have actively rejected joining such a hierarchical institution because of some of the challenges that brings.
So I think that from an institutional level, that there's still room for these sorts of things, right? Like in that the history of the church, right? If it's like there was Jesus, then there was these sort of early Christian communities, the Council of Nicaea.
Anne's not asking us to do a whole history of the church, not the people on her podcast.
But then I understand that. But Martin Luther, he did his own thing then, right? Like he had his 95 Theses, and he broke away and created something different for that time and space in the community, and that became its own thing. King Henry had his own thing. People
maybe not the best example.
People moved to America.
So
they put up some tents, right? And that they had to sort of create and sort of continuously go back to the soil and create something new to speak to the time and space. And there's still room for that. And and it still happens organically. I think that Bruderhof were also an example that I was thinking of as well. But there's been other.
Well, the Moravians. Like so it's fascinating that Josh grew up in this space. And when he was 10, he would do like his history tours of Bethlehem. And the Moravians came and were a very similar community to the Bruderhof. So very much communally based. In fact, I recently read a book Josh got me for Christmas. That was a group of letters from what I argue is a spiritual mother, Mary Penry, who was a single sister living in this community. And they had a space for women who wanted to be single to live together. And so all the women just chose to stay single. They were like, oh, if I can live singly and I don't have to be married, like 40% of them just stayed single. So I found it fascinating that they were able to live in this community. And if they chose to marry, eventually they could, and they could still be in the community. So it wasn't like you had to, this is only a place if you're single or married, or it was a space of shared, and they weren't perfect, right? Like we talked about their record on racism, that's there. But just two examples I wanted to highlight briefly that kind of demonstrate the tension between the beauty of the mother church ideal lived out in biodiverse ways in different Christian communities, and then also the challenges. So I was really lucky with, through you actually, Anne, met a wonderful woman named Laura Fabrici, who we recently discovered we are both regular visitors of this convent down the street from me, less than a mile. And she's been going with her family for 15 years. And it has a really precious story that we don't have time to tell.
But found her name in that book.
So this is after I saw you last, Anne. Josh and I were taking a date at the convent, and there's a garden and there's a tree that has a mailbox with a notebook in it.
Oh,
and the notebook
goodness.
is essentially a guest book.
And you found Laura Fabrici's name?
She was the last entry, and then two before hers was us. So we had written in it in September. Laura wrote it in October. I met Laura in November, and then in December, I texted her and I was like, "I'm at the convent. I see you wrote in the guest book too." And so we've been texting back and forth. And I have just recently finished reading The Keys to Bonhoeffer's House, which is a brilliant book that she wrote, which I bought immediately upon meeting her and intended to read a few months ago and did not get to read it. But I finished it like a week ago. And what's fascinating, is the story in that book of it's a way into Bonhoeffer. She jokes like we all, like if you're in certain professional Christian circles, like dropping Bonhoeffer's name or Hannah Arendt, like there's certain cachet there. And she even kind of pokes at that, which I appreciate. And she was like, so she's in Germany, her husband's stationed there, part of the State Department. she's trying to grow where she's planted. Bonhoeffer's house is down the street. So she goes one day and eventually she finds herself leading tours there. But she also then takes her family on field trips, which is something I do. I love this, to places that she wanted to get to know. And so it's both a beautiful example of a modern Christian family, I'd say, living out spiritual motherhood by becoming deeply place-based and living into someone else's Christian story.
And a bit Charlotte Mason-y too.
Exactly.
And,
right.
and understanding, like attending to, again, this is sort of what I tried to say about the flashlight, attending to the contextual details that yield public heroism, say in Bonhoeffer's case.
Exactly. And the women in his life, but she goes to all these places around Germany. And it just is incredible to me because I was too embarrassed to publicly admit that so much of the source material or things I discover are through taking my children places. But Bonhoeffer specifically, her book shed like this deeply personal light for Bonhoeffer for me. And this piece around like, where can the church go to that is really harmful, that is actually maybe not even living out its vocational calling to spiritual motherhood, which I personally believe it holds. I mean, I would call her Mother Church. And that is in places like Germany, maybe during World War II or before World War II, when the church was essentially complicit to a large extent, and that those who formed other communities like the Bruderhof, like Bonhoeffer's community, they were essentially persecuted to the fullest extent possible, right? Bonhoeffer lost his life. And it's incredible. And one piece in the book, she talks about how if he'd been lived to be 70, and it's only in the 70s that she's saying like, maybe his wife celebrated his anniversary in the 70s of his 70th birthday. And you just think like he, in many ways, lost his life. Arguably, part of that was the failings of the church, the institutional church in Germany, to stand up to the Nazis. And I don't know if that would have changed. I'm not a very good political strategist, but you think about those types of failings, and I don't think that you can say that the institutional church in that context was holding up its motherhood calling if it is willing to align itself with really harmful, dehumanizing, and ideologies.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know what you saying that story about the church living up to its sort of maternal role, but it does remind me. There's a quote that we use in the article from Alice von Hildebrand. Motherhood is not only the biological maternity, it is a spiritual maternity. Pray to God, and He will send you spiritual children.
She's another one who fled because of her faith, fled the Holocaust, and I think her words are just so powerful.
Yeah, and I think that this quote is really a doorway that people can enter into this idea of spiritual motherhood. That, again, this is not maternity. This is a safe space that men can participate in, because this is not about biological maternity. Just as like Jesus can be referred to as her to sort of capture that maternal essence while him still remaining biologically male.
Well, I would not use female pronouns for Jesus.
I know. I'm just referencing earlier. So Henry said something that I think that had a big impact on you too. But he would say that all ceremony is for the promotion and redemption of life, and being a parent. So Henry was an artist, and he would create things, right? He created a community, he created artwork, he created children. That those acts is promoting life and redeeming life, and that anybody can do that. And when you take that stance to your vocation, to your community, to your spiritual life, to your interactions with everyday people on the street, with your interactions with the natural world around us, when you see all of your actions and try to bring all of your actions into alignment with promoting and redeeming life, I think that is spiritual motherhood.
Yeah. I mean, we named our daughter Phoebe. A big inspiration for that was when I was pregnant, I read a book that was a historical novel about the life of Phoebe. So I'm sure some of it's not accurate, but really talking about how she existed in these networks, right? With Priscilla and Aquila in the early church, how really it was Paul vouching for her that was enough. It was the deep love they had for Paul that opened the door for her. He told them, love her as she's given love graciously to us and supported our community financially in other ways. And seeing that the role of women in the early church too is so powerful. I mean, she was sent probably as a young widow as an emissary, carrying Paul's letter to the Romans, traveling by herself. I mean, and then also it's pretty clear in that time that they wouldn't have just delivered the letter. The people that delivered it would also have been responsible for reading out loud, very much Charlotte Mason, and then translating, narrating back the interior meetings, answering questions, being able to serve as the interpreter and translator. And so when we think we could get into arguments, Anne, as you're mentioning, like maybe you will in the future, about like institutional roles with women in the church or things like that. And maybe even some of us land in different places there. Sometimes Josh and I do. But when it comes to the role of spiritual motherhood, it is the capacity of women to care and to be given the freedom to care. And also the capacity of men to be given the freedom to care and not to be judged as somehow less masculine for living out what is also a very human, God-given capacity that they have.
Right. This conversation could go on for years, and I hope it does. It feels like that this concept, spiritual motherhood, is a doorway. It's like stained glass that refracts into a wholeness of our world, and of reality and of love ultimately. And I think there's some other doorways, other paradigms that could do the same thing for the same world, all pointing to the same truth of the creational reality. Thank you so very much for trusting our listeners with all that you have.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you.
Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution. Check out this podcast's cultural and theological seedbed at www.comet.org, where you'll find imagination for a thriving society animated by the Christian humanist tradition, including regular writing by Alan Jacobs and other literary luminaries, The Welcome Table hosted by Greg Thompson, Zealots at the Gate, a feisty new podcast about religion and democracy featuring Shadi Hamid and Matthew Koenig, and a whole lot more. And consider getting involved in our growing Comet community. You can write, you can read, you can host a Comet supper in your neighborhood, or you can participate in a conversation with your fellow readers and an author. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comet.org and expect a substantive exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comet Magazine, edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.